Hello, I'm Scott Nichol, and this presentation is aimed at the colleagues within my school who work with primary school aged children. Just calm down. In response to the stressful situations your learners have been in, how many times have you responded this or a similar way? Today, my aim is to share with you information about stress and how we can replace this phrase with a more effective, evidence informed toolkit to support our learners with stress. To do this, I will discuss the following questions 1. What is stress and how does it affect the brain? 2. What situations or conditions trigger stress in an educational setting? And 3. What can educators do to create optimal learning environments that reduce stress for pupils and support them in dealing with stress effectively? So, what is stress? Well, simply put, stress is the body's automatic response to sensory information which the brain perceives as a potential threat. Think of it as the brain's hardwired response to any information which threatens the status quo. However, it is important to note that not all stress is negative. There are many situations we encounter in our lives that are stressful but involve personal growth and lead to positive outcomes. The stress involved in these situations is at the right level to motivate us, but not overwhelming enough that we cannot complete the task. Much of this depends on the people's perceptions of the stressor and the impact it has on you. One person's positive stressor, known as eustress, is another person's negative stressor, known as distress. However, distress would commonly be associated with negative outcomes that become overwhelming or physically or emotionally damaging. Interesting. Boredom can also trigger distress, as understimulation also triggers the stress response. In summary, distress occurs when you are under or overstimulated, and eustress is a sweet spot in the middle, the Goldilocks zone. So, what neural processes are involved in triggering of this stress response, whether positive or negative? As explained by Eric Janssen, the brain takes in a range of sensory information which is sent to an area of the brain called the thalamus, which is part of the limbic system and is located in this area of the brain. At the same time, this information is relayed to other parts of the brain associated with a specific type of sensory information being received. This information is also sent to the amygdala, another part of the limbic system which detects threats. If the information under or overstimulates the amygdala, which is considered distress, the stress response is triggered, releasing chemicals in the brain such as cortisol and adrenaline, resulting in fight, flight, freeze, or fragment behaviors. This often manifests as acting out or zoning out behaviors in the classroom setting. This continues until the threat is dealt with. Alternatively, if the information sent to the amygdala is within our Goldilocks zone of eustress, it is transferred to the prefrontal cortex, which, as Julie Willis discusses, this is the area of the brain involved in deeper thought and analysis and facilitates effective learning. Whether the stressor is positive or negative, the stress response is often short lived. But unfortunately, it can become long term, chronic stress if this response is triggered frequently. This is because the neurons in the brain transfer information via synapses, and those which are used more frequently become stronger. As Judy Willis highlights, making the neural pathways involved in the stress response more reactive and more likely to be triggered as these pathways will be stronger. It becomes a vicious cycle where the stress response strengthens those neural pathways, making the stress response even more reactive. Simultaneously, the pathways within the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, become weaker as they are used less frequently. This compounds the problem as the prefrontal cortex has an important role to play in soothing the amygdala, a key player in the triggering of the stress response. This is emphasized by various studies, including those of Park et al. And Gaffrey et al., which state the strength of the connection between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala is important in emotional regulation. Put simply, imagine these brain areas as a friendship. When the amygdala becomes overstimulated, the prefrontal cortex assumes the role of a supportive friend, soothing them and making them feel better. However, the connectivity between these brain areas is affected greatly by stress, particularly during childhood, with greater and more frequent stress weakening this connection. In our metaphor, essentially, a stronger that has been built over years from childhood is more effective than one which has been inconsistent and fleeting. Unfortunately, as highlighted by Kim et al., children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to experience stress during childhood and have increased amygdala reactivity. In addition, as John Medina discusses, chronic stress can actually cause part of the brain to atrophy, can weaken the immune system, making illness more likely, and lead to increased risk of developing a range of health conditions such as diabetes. Stress is the enemy not just of learning, but of well-being, and can have a profound effect on our learners, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which many of our pupils are. But what situations or environmental conditions can trigger this response in our learners in school? Well, McTeague and Willis outline a range of stressors in educational settings, and as expected, factors including test anxiety and workload are present. However, interestingly, other factors can trigger a stress response in children, including boredom, a lack of purpose or relevance in learning, and relationship issues with peers. These may not be at the forefront of teachers' minds when considering stress triggers in the classroom, but they are perhaps a few of the most common factors that trigger stress in our learners. How many times have you seen learners disengaged, acting out by shouting out, or distracting others, or perhaps zoning out with stationery, playing with it, gazing out of the window, perhaps, and assume this was due to distraction by peers, laziness, or an additional support need, rather than a pupil who is understimulated and in need of challenge or purpose in their learning? How many times have you been ambushed at the end of playtime with pupils desperately seeking justice for the wrongdoings of others and simply brush this off, saying something along the lines of, "Playtime is over, so the situation is over"? In these situations, we as teachers fail to appreciate the workings of the brain and support our learners effectively. Understanding the brain and the impact these sorts of situations have on the brain is crucial in supporting us to be proactive and create optimal learning environments where these stressors are limited and to respond appropriately when faced with these familiar problems. The reality is that although we are focused on teaching and learning, these situations can take time away from lessons when dealing with them. But they can't be viewed as insignificant, as children's emotional states provide the foundations for learning. As Willis discusses, when the amygdala is under or overstimulated, information is not processed effectively by the prefrontal cortex, the place where deep learning and thought occur. Many researchers reinforce this, such as Bruce Perry and his neurosequential model. This model describes the steps that must be taken to facilitate learning, and he summarizes this as a three-step process called regulate, relate, and reason. Regulate involves calming down, relate involves connecting with others, and reason involves rational thought and higher order thinking. Emotional regulation is the bedrock on which higher order thinking and learning occur, so teachers must consider this as the starting point in all learning. Considering what they can do to create an optimal learning environment to support regulation and equip pupils to deal with stressful situations more effectively. In addition, as well as supporting learning, teachers have the critical role to play in supporting learners with chronic stress, which, as highlighted already, can have detrimental effects on behaviour, learning, and health, and which many of our pupils, due to their socio-economic backgrounds, are potentially more susceptible to. So, how is this achieved? What practical steps can be taken? There are many practical steps teachers can take to address the range of stressors listed by McTeague and Willis, and I would encourage you to research these further, looking specifically into the stressors that are most common in your learning environment. However, I will focus on the stressors so far: boredom and lack of purpose in learning, which stem from understimulation, and relationship issues, which involves overstimulation. One way in which teachers can create an optimal learning environment that addresses these issues is through the provision of play or play-based approaches as part of children's learning experiences. Play not only facilitates socialization, which can support the forging of stronger peer bonds, but presents opportunities to model how to resolve social issues when conflict occurs. This is worthwhile for teachers to do. As highlighted by Titsworth et al., teachers who support children's social development have happier pupils. Happier students have less stress, allowing them to utilize their prefrontal cortexes effectively and focus on learning. This is supported by Korpashuk, et al., who found that teachers focusing on social skills supported pupils in achieving academic outcomes. In addition, play-based learning allows children choice and freedom to engage with learning activities at a level which matches their capabilities and provides them with an appropriate level of challenge. Assuming this is planned and executed well, providing students with various learning opportunities and sufficient resources, children will be able to choose activities which they find enjoyable and worthwhile engaging with. Instead of providing pre-assigned activities, children are able to choose what motivates them rather than what bores them, providing the appropriate level of stimulation. In my class, I have implemented this in the form of workstations, a play-based approach designed using curriculum outcomes. I have a series of workstations set up, including writing, maths, engineering, textiles, art, and reading stations. And at these stations, pupils are provided with relevant resources, suggested activities, how-to guides, and they are changed frequently to provide new challenges and increase engagement. Another practical step teachers can take to support the pupils is to teach them skills for dealing with stressful situations when they occur. One strategy that has been shown to be effective in supporting pupils with emotional regulation is mindfulness. As described by Dr. Daniel Siegel, a clinical psychologist and advocate of mindfulness, this practice involves being aware of one's internal emotions and he suggests it has a huge role to play in supporting the emotional well-being of our children. An increasing amount of research concurs with him, including a recent study by Bauer et al., which showed that mindfulness training reduced children's amygdala reactivity to fearful faces and also strengthened connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, which we know is important in emotional regulation. Is a plethora of mindfulness resources and exercises that teachers can use to support their learners in developing mindfulness skills. One mindful breathing technique is called 3 sighs. It involves taking 3 deep breaths, but controlled breaths, and releasing each of them with a sigh. This practice activates the vagus nerve, stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system, a system involved in relaxing the brain and the body. I began completing mindfulness with my class after lunchtimes as I noticed they struggled to focus after this break, and they often had relationship issues that caused them distress in the playground. Anecdotally, the class had been more relaxed and engaged as a result, and students have reported feeling more relaxed and calm. So, what are the key messages? 1. Stress is a natural response to perceived threats, and it can have a negative impact on learning as well as health. 2. Boredom, lack of purposeful activities, and relationship issues can trigger the stress response in our pupils. 3. Emotional regulation is fundamental for teachers to focus on. It provides the foundations for all learning, and teaching children mindfulness is a great strategy to help them in achieving this. Thank you for listening.